The rule that's wrong for most people. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If you built the 3 to 6 month emergency fund exactly like every article told you to, and you still feel exposed every time a client goes quiet or a layoff rumor hits your industry, why does the number in your savings account not match the feeling in your stomach? And if you never got there, if you've been stuck at 6 weeks of expenses for 2 years, feeling like a financial failure, why does everyone else seem to treat this number like it's gravity, like it's just a law of the universe you're failing to obey? The uncomfortable answer is that the number was never yours to begin with. 3 to 6 months of expenses is not a measurement of your risk. It's a rounded, mass-produced average, built to be repeatable in a magazine article, not built to be accurate for the specific shape of your income and your job. Some of you are sitting on a buffer that's actually too small for what you do for a living. Some of you are sitting on a buffer that's too large, quietly losing value to inflation while it does nothing. And almost nobody has actually run the math to find out which one they are. Think about how strange that is when you say it plainly. We don't apply one flat number to how much insurance someone needs on a car because a 15-year-old sedan and a new truck carry different risk. We don't apply one flat number to how much someone should have in a retirement account at a given age because income and timeline differ. But somehow, for the single most repeated piece of advice in personal finance, everyone from a salaried accountant to a freelance photographer to a commission-only recruiter gets handed the exact same range, as if their financial lives were interchangeable. That's what we're doing today. Not another psychological trap, not another story about willpower or self-sabotage. A calculation. We're going to take the variables that actually determine how much cash you need between paychecks, and we're going to show you how to size your own number instead of borrowing someone else's. By the end, the goal isn't just a new opinion about savings. It's a number you can actually defend, one that fits the shape of your specific income, your specific job market, and your specific obligations, where the rule actually came from. Before we rebuild it, it's worth knowing what we're rebuilding, because the 3 to 6 month figure has a strange kind of authority. Nobody can tell you where it originated. Ask a financial planner where the number comes from, and you'll get a shrug and a reference to standard practice. That's because it is standard practice. It's the number that gets taught in certified financial planning coursework, repeated in personal finance columns, echoed by every budgeting app that wants a round figure to put on a progress bar. There's no single founding study behind it, no landmark piece of research that ran the numbers on income volatility and reemployment timelines and arrived at 6 as the optimal multiple. It's closer to a professional consensus that calcified into gospel simply through repetition. Enough advisors said it enough times, in enough articles, on enough morning shows, that it stopped sounding like a rough estimate and started sounding like a law of physics. Compare that to how a salaried employee's ideal buffer differs from a self-employed one's, and you start to see the problem immediately. A rule built for teachability has to be simple enough to fit in a headline. It can't ask you what industry you're in, whether your income arrives in one predictable deposit or 6 unpredictable ones, whether you have a kid who needs daycare covered, no matter what happens to your income. It has to work badly for everyone, which means it works well for almost no one. That's not a conspiracy. Rules of thumb exist because most people won't sit down and do the math, so the industry gives them a number that's good enough to prevent total disaster for the average case. But you are not the average case. Nobody is. The average case is a statistical fiction that no real household actually occupies. So the rule survives not because it's accurate. It survives because it's easy to say in one sentence, easy to print in a listicle, easy to nod along to on a podcast. Keep that in mind as we go, because it's the thread running under everything else today. Simple and correct are not the same thing, And the gap between them is where a lot of financial anxiety quietly lives. What an emergency fund really insures against. Let's fix the framing, because emergency fund is a vague name for a specific job. People hear emergency and picture a car repair, a broken water heater, a vet bill. Those are real costs, but they're not what a proper emergency fund is built to absorb. An emergency fund's actual job, the one thing it exists to insure against, is income interruption. It's the bridge between the day a paycheck stops and the day a new one starts. That's it. That's the whole insurance policy. Compare that to a one-off surprise cost. A surprise cost is solved with a smaller, separate buffer, or with a sinking fund you build for known irregular expenses, like car maintenance or annual insurance premiums, things you know are coming even if you don't know exactly when. Bundling both jobs into one undifferentiated pile of savings is part of why the number feels wrong to so many people. You're asking one account to do two different jobs at once, and it's structurally too small or too vague for either one. $1,000 pulled out for a transmission repair shouldn't be treated the same way, mentally or mathematically, as 3 months of rent disappearing because a client roster went quiet. And here's where the picture gets uncomfortable at a population level. The Federal Reserve's report on the economic well-being of U.S. households, an annual survey most people have never heard of, has repeatedly found that a meaningful share of American adults would struggle to cover even a modest unplanned expense with cash on hand. That's not a fringe statistic. That's a large, recurring finding, year after year, across a huge cross-section of income levels, including plenty of households that would look financially stable from the outside. Sit with the contrast for a second. Millions of people are simultaneously under-buffered against a paycheck disappearing and unprepared for a $400 surprise. Two different problems, and a flat, generic rule addressing neither one with any precision. That's the real diagnosis. Not that people are bad at saving, that the target they're aiming at was never actually calibrated to the thing that can hurt them. So, if income interruption is the real threat, the obvious next question is what actually determines how bad that interruption could be for you, specifically. That's not a personality trait. It's math, and it starts with a variable almost nobody talks about by name. The variable the flat rule ignores. That variable is income volatility, and it's the single biggest reason the same number can be wildly wrong for two different people earning the exact same annual salary. The JPMorgan Chase Institute has run some of the most detailed research available on this in a body of work that started with a study called Weathering Volatility and continued in follow-on research since. What they found, using real bank account data rather than self-reported surveys, is that month-to-month income and spending swing far more violently for a large share of households than an annual number would ever suggest. Here's the contrast that matters. A salaried employee with a predictable paycheck has, by definition, low income volatility. The same amount lands on the same schedule, month after month, until the day it doesn't. A freelancer, a commission-based salesperson, a gig worker, someone doing platform delivery work or seasonal contracting can hit that exact same annual income total through a completely different pattern. A great month followed by a lean one. A quarter with 2 big client payments followed by a quarter with none. The Institute's research shows that this isn't a minor statistical footnote. It's a structurally different financial experience, even when the yearly total on a tax return looks identical. Picture two people, both earning around $70,000 a year. One is a mid-level employee at a stable company, paid the same amount every 2 weeks without variation. The other is a freelance graphic designer who ends the year at the exact same $70,000, but got there through a $17,000 quarter, followed by a $9,000 quarter, followed by another surge, followed by a slow stretch. On paper, in a spreadsheet that only tracks annual totals, they look identical. In lived experience, one of them has never had a month where the number felt uncertain, and the other has had 4 months out of 12 where the number felt genuinely unpredictable, even in a normal year where nothing technically went wrong. Set those two people side by side and the mismatch becomes obvious. One person's income is basically a flat line with a single potential breakpoint, the day they're let go. The other person's income is already jagged every single month, whether anything has technically gone wrong or not. Applying the same flat number to both of them treats a flat line and a jagged line as if they carry the same risk. They don't. And that mismatch, more than any other single factor, is why so many gig and commission earners feel perpetually behind on a target that was never built with their income pattern in mind, while some salaried earners are sitting comfortably past a target that barely matters for them. It's also worth noticing that volatility isn't only about the bad months. It's about the unpredictability of the good ones too. A salaried employee can plan a year in advance because next April looks roughly like this April. A volatile earner often can't, because the shape of the next 12 months genuinely isn't knowable yet, which means the buffer isn't just protecting against a downturn. It's absorbing the basic uncertainty of not knowing in advance which months will be strong and which will be thin. Two incomes, two different real numbers. Let's make the contrast concrete, because abstractions don't change behavior. Numbers do. Take a salaried employee in a reasonably stable industry. If they lose their job, there's a single identifiable event, the termination date, and from there, a fairly predictable runway. Unemployment benefits often kick in. Severance sometimes applies. The time to next paycheck, statistically, tends to fall somewhere in the range of a few weeks to a couple of months for a lot of roles, obviously with real variation by industry and seniority. But the point is, it's one event with a start, and usually a foreseeable end. You can reasonably budget for a single gap because the gap has edges. Now, take a commission-based salesperson, a freelance designer, or a gig platform driver. There is no single job loss event to insure against because there was never a single job to lose in the first place. The uncertainty isn't a one-time cliff, it's baked into every month. A slow month isn't a crisis in the traditional sense, it's just Tuesday. But stack 4 or 5 slow months in a row, which is entirely plausible for volatile income types, especially around seasonal dips or a shift in a platform's algorithm or a client's budget cycle, and you've got a sustained gap that a few weeks of expenses buffer does absolutely nothing to cover. This is the part where the flat rule doesn't just underserve one side, it actively measures the wrong thing for each side. For the salaried employee, 3 to 6 months is trying to cover a single boundable event, something with a clear start and, statistically, a foreseeable end. For the volatile earner, 3 to 6 months is trying to cover an ongoing condition, something with no clean edges at all. And a boundable event buffer is the wrong shape of tool for an ongoing condition, in the same way an umbrella is the wrong tool for a leaking roof. Same number, 2 completely different jobs being asked of it, and only one of those jobs is realistic for that number to actually do. Push the comparison one step further, and the gap widens again. The salaried worker's runway also tends to come with some built-in support, unemployment insurance, possibly a severance package, sometimes continued benefits for a stretch. The volatile earner usually has none of that scaffolding underneath a slow quarter. No unemployment claim to file when a freelance pipeline dries up. No severance for a commission structure that quietly stopped paying out. The same dollar amount of buffer is doing more unassisted work for one of these two people than for the other, which is one more reason a flat number can't fairly represent both situations. If income volatility is variable 1, there's a second variable hiding right behind it, one that has nothing to do with how your paycheck arrives, and everything to do with how fast you could replace it if it stopped. The hidden liquidity variable. Call this one job market liquidity, And it's the variable that almost never makes it into personal finance content because it's slightly less tidy than a savings percentage. It's a basic labor economics concept. How quickly someone finds comparable paying work after losing income depends heavily on two things: how specialized their role is, and how many similar employers exist in their reachable market, whether that market is local or fully remote. Compare a generalist role that exists at hundreds of companies in a given metro area, retail management, general administrative work, a widely used technical skill set, against a highly specialized or niche role, a narrow subfield of research, a leadership position that only exists at a handful of comparable organizations, a skill set tied to one particular industry that's currently contracting. The generalist, all else equal, typically has more reemployment options simply because there's more surface area of demand to hit. 100 companies hiring for a role means 100 chances at once. The specialist may be excellent at what they do and still face a materially longer real search, not because of any personal failing, but because the pool of employers who need exactly that skill set at exactly that level is small by definition, sometimes small enough that it's literally a handful of names. And if none of them happen to be hiring the month you need them to be, the search simply takes longer. Here's the uncomfortable part. This variable is completely independent of income level. A highly paid specialist and a modestly paid specialist can face the same elongated search time if their field is narrow enough. Two people earning identical salaries in identical volatility patterns can still need very different buffer sizes, purely because one of them could realistically find comparable work in 3 weeks, and the other realistically needs 4 months. Someone in a widely hired remote-friendly field might apply to 15 roles in a week. Someone in a narrow regional specialty might watch job boards for a month before a single relevant opening appears. A flat rule has no mechanism to account for that at all, because it was never asking the question in the first place. It's also worth being honest that liquidity can be improved, not just measured. Widening your search geography by being open to remote work, keeping a skill set broad enough to apply across adjacent roles rather than one narrow title, maintaining a network that hears about openings before they're posted publicly. All of these things raise your liquidity score over time. None of that changes what your buffer needs to be today, but it's a reminder that this variable isn't fixed forever. It's a snapshot of your current position in your current market. So far, we've covered how your income arrives and how fast you could replace it if it stopped. There's a third variable, and it doesn't touch your income at all. It touches the other side of the ledger. What you actually have to spend no matter what. Dependents and fixed costs multiply the number. Every buffer calculation eventually runs into the expense side of the equation, and the flat rule treats all expenses as if they're equally elastic, which they are not. Split your monthly spending into 2 honest categories. Compressible spending is what you could cut fast in a real crisis without anyone getting hurt. Subscriptions, dining out, discretionary shopping, the upgraded gym membership, the streaming bundle you barely use. Fixed spending is what does not move regardless of how bad the month gets. Rent or a mortgage. Dependent care, whether that's daycare, elder care, or anything in between. Minimum debt payments. Recurring medical costs that don't pause because your income did. A household with a high proportion of compressible spending has a hidden shock absorber that a flat number doesn't credit them for. If income stops, they can slash their monthly burn rate within days, cancel the subscriptions, cook at home, put discretionary purchases on hold, which effectively stretches whatever buffer they have, sometimes by a meaningful margin. A household with a high proportion of fixed spending, especially one with dependents, doesn't have that same lever. You can't unenroll a child from daycare for a month to save cash without real, immediate consequences to your ability to work at all. You can't skip a mortgage payment without real consequences to your credit and your housing. The obligations stay exactly where they are, at exactly the same size, for the entire length of the income gap, whether that gap lasts 3 weeks or 3 months. That means two households with the identical income volatility, and identical job market liquidity can still need genuinely different buffer sizes, purely because one of them has the flexibility to compress spend fast, and the other structurally does not. This is the variable most people intuitively sense but rarely name, which is why "I have kids, so I feel like I need more saved" is usually treated as an emotional statement instead of what it actually is, a completely rational response to a real structural constraint that shows up in the math whether or not anyone bothers to calculate it explicitly. There's a compounding effect worth naming here too. Dependents don't just add a fixed cost, they often also reduce your job market liquidity at the same time. Because a parent might not be able to relocate for a role the way a single person could, or might need to prioritize a job with specific hours or benefits over the fastest available offer. So the three variables aren't always independent of each other. Sometimes a life circumstance moves more than one dial at once, and the honest version of this framework accounts for that, instead of pretending each variable lives in its own sealed box, where the rule fails in both directions. Put all three variables next to each other: income volatility, job market liquidity, and the ratio of fixed to compressible expenses, and the flat rule's failure becomes symmetrical. It doesn't just fail one type of person. It fails in two opposite directions at once, and it's worth being fair to both. On one side, picture a salaried employee in a stable, widely hired field, single, no dependents, mostly compressible expenses, a healthy proportion of discretionary spend they could cut within a week if they had to. Low volatility, high liquidity, low fixed obligation. For this person, 6 months of expenses sitting in cash isn't caution, it's an overbuffer. That money is sitting idle, quietly losing purchasing power to inflation. Every year it isn't invested or working toward another goal. Once a genuinely appropriate, smaller true risk buffer has already been met. The flat rule isn't protecting this person. It's costing them, year after year, in the form of returns they never captured, because the cash was parked far past the point of usefulness. On the other side, picture a freelancer or commission earner in a specialized narrow field with a dependent and a mortgage, mostly fixed expenses that can't be compressed on short notice. High volatility, low liquidity, high fixed obligation. For this person, 6 months isn't a comfortable ceiling, it's a dangerously optimistic floor. A slow stretch in a narrow market, combined with fixed obligations that don't budge, can eat 6 months faster than most people expect. And the flat rule sent them into that stretch, believing they'd done everything right, believing they'd hit the target, only to find the target was never sized for someone in their position in the first place. Same rule. Number. 2 people, both of whom followed the advice exactly as written, and it left one of them sitting on wasted cash and the other one exposed to a real gap they thought they'd already covered. That's not a minor calibration error. That's the rule getting both ends of the spectrum wrong at the same time. Which is about as clear a signal as you'll get that the problem isn't the concept of a buffer. It's the idea that one size was ever going to fit everyone holding it. And the two of them will never compare notes because personal finance content almost never puts these two profiles side by side. It just repeats the same range to both and lets them each assume they're the exception. A framework instead of a number. So here's the fix. And it's not a new headline number to replace the old one, because that would just be the same mistake with a different digit. It's a framework, 3 questions you actually answer for yourself, each rated roughly low, medium, or high, based on your real circumstances rather than a national average. First, income volatility. Is your income essentially flat and predictable month to month, meaning low volatility? Or does it swing meaningfully even in a normal, nothing has gone wrong month, meaning medium to high volatility? Salaried with a stable employer generally sits low. Full commission, freelance, or gig income generally sits medium to high, and the more your income depends on a small number of clients or accounts, the higher that rating climbs. Second, job market liquidity. If your income stopped tomorrow, how many comparable employers or income sources exist within your reachable market, physical or remote? A widely hired, generalist skill set generally sits high liquidity, meaning faster likely reemployment. A narrow, specialized role in a small field, or one tied to a single struggling industry, generally sits low liquidity, meaning a longer likely search. And it's worth being honest with yourself about which category your specific role actually falls into rather than assuming your skills are more transferable than they are. Third, fixed obligation load. What proportion of your monthly spend is genuinely fixed, rent, dependents, minimum debt payments, essential medical costs, versus how much is compressible on short notice? A high proportion of fixed, non-negotiable spend pushes this rating higher, and dependents in particular tend to push this rating up regardless of income level. Now here's the directional logic, and this is deliberately a sizing framework, not individualized financial advice, because only you can weigh your own numbers with full knowledge of your actual situation. As volatility rises, your target range should widen. As job market liquidity falls, meaning reemployment would likely take longer, your target range should widen. As fixed obligation load rises, your target range should widen. Low across all three, you may reasonably land under the old 3-month floor. High across all three, you may reasonably need to go well past 6 months, sometimes closer to 9 or 12. The number was never supposed to be flat. It was always supposed to move with you, expanding and contracting as your actual risk profile changes. Try running yourself through it right now, even roughly. Say your volatility is medium because you're salaried, but in an industry that's had a couple of rounds of layoffs recently. Your liquidity is medium, a solid but not oversaturated field. Your fixed obligation load is medium, no dependents yet, but a mortgage. That's a mostly medium profile, which lands you somewhere in the middle of the old range, maybe 4 to 5 months. Not because a magazine told you so, but because you actually walked through the math, and that's where your specific answers put you. Building the number without paralysis. Knowing your real target and actually having it saved are two different problems, and the second one is where a lot of people freeze, especially if their honest framework score comes back needing a bigger number than they currently have sitting in the bank. So don't start by staring at the full calculated target. Start with a smaller first milestone, enough to cover one real gap month, fully funded. That's a finite, achievable goal you can hit in a matter of weeks or a few months, depending on your savings rate, and it gets the most dangerous scenario, a genuinely empty buffer during an income gap, off the table immediately, before you worry about the rest of the range. Once that first milestone is funded, build toward the fuller calculated range at a pace that doesn't wreck your quality of life along the way. There's no prize for getting there in 3 months instead of 8. And grinding yourself down to hit an arbitrary speed target usually just leads to burnout or abandoning the goal altogether. And where you keep it matters less than people think it does. This is not the money to optimize for yield. Keep it in a plainly liquid, boring account, something you can access within a day or two without penalty, without a market dip deciding how much of it you actually have when you need it most. The entire value of this money is that it's there, instantly, without drama, without a phone call, without waiting for a settlement period. Last practical point. This number is not a one-time calculation you set and forget. Revisit it whenever a major variable actually changes. A new job that shifts your volatility profile. A new dependent that raises your fixed obligation load. A move into a smaller job market that lowers your liquidity. A shift from salaried to self-employed, which usually moves all 3 variables at once and deserves a full recalculation, not a small adjustment. The framework isn't a plaque you hang once and admire. It's a dial you check back on every time your real risk shape changes. The number should track your risk, not a headline. So where does that leave the original rule? It's not that having a cash buffer is bad advice. It never was. The problem was always the assumption sitting quietly underneath it, that one size was ever going to fit a salaried employee, a commission earner, a specialist in a shrinking niche, and a generalist in a booming market, all at once. It can't, because their real risk isn't the same, even when their income is. 3 things to carry with you. Income volatility tells you how jagged your paycheck really is. Job market liquidity tells you how fast you could realistically replace it if it stopped. Fixed obligation load tells you how much room you actually have to cut spend and buy yourself time. Score yourself honestly on those 3, and you'll land on a number that's actually built for your life, not a number that was built to fit in a headline and survive on repetition alone. If this reframed how you think about your own buffer, you know what to do. Hit follow so the next one lands in front of you. And if you want more of these practical rebuilds instead of another warning about your own psychology, stick around. That's exactly the kind of thing we're doing next.